We're gonna start recording. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Need a source sheet.
Oh, you need a source sheet. Okay.
Okay.
We'll give out source sheets. We should preface this, thank you, by saying that if the source sheets seem a little hefty this week, it's my fault and I apologize. Yeah. Those of you who are online will have the lighter version. But this is a shortened version of I know you look incredulous, but there's a book. I forgot to bring it. We'll bring it next week. There's actually a series of books called Hilchot Nashim, published by Koren, and I wrote the article on Megillah. So this is like a shortened form of that. So I promise that we won't read everything.
Okay, great. So I think many of us were together last week, but so I just want to not review what we did last week, but review the framework or taxonomy that I introduced last week, which I thought was helpful. And so I'm going to say it again. And that is sort of thinking through some of these mitzvot that we've been studying and thinking through a taxonomy of the degrees to which we saw some examples where the primary texts primary sources are inclusive and include women. And even just a straightforward basic reading of the primary sources would advocate for change. An example I gave of that was women who eat together should make a zimun. The overwhelming early, consensus of early sources would encourage that, even if for some number of years it wasn't very common in certain places. Last week you saw an example of Kriyat HaTorah, where many of the early sources are restrictive, but we saw that there is some gray area to push through if one is so inclined. And this week is, I think, more similar to Kiddush, our first week, where I think we'll see that the earliest, most authoritative, most simple sources, so simple reading of those early sources are all inclusive of women in these mitzvot, in these obligations of Megillah reading, and it's only let's say the accretion of some other sources or there's a counter voice, maybe you want to say, that is more restrictive. And so you have a strong inclusive voice with a parallel, more restrictive path. But I find that sort of taxonomy helpful to sort of think about what the dynamic is, what's the terrain that we're navigating. I think that all, I guess, like begs the question of, maybe this is for a different occasion, like what's the goal? Like what's the end game? What are we trying to do? I think for these classes, we're trying to understand the landscape and to understand sort of what the sources say. I think a secondary question then, or maybe the primary question that we can then use these sources to try to play through is then what do we want to do with it? Okay, with that, but okay.
With those early sources that said women could read, do we know what the actual practice was at that time? Did women actually read?
Nope, we have no idea. In general, right? We don't really know how people practiced for most things, right? Like not a lot of evidence on that. But we'll take a look at the early sources and you can see what you think. You can see if you can uncover any evidence. The first thing on the source sheets is just a list of questions, which, right, if you look at the list of questions, I have a lot of questions, and so that's why there's a lot of answers. Okay, that's my excuse. The first thing we need to ask about is the nature of woman's obligation in Megillah reading. I missed last week, but 2 weeks ago we talked about, right, that's always the baseline, right, in terms of that paradigm that David mentioned. If you're going to say inclusive, exclusive, but the first question is who's obligated in this mitzvah, and then once you establish the level of obligation, then you can try to ask some questions about who can do what for whom, because in general you need a shared level of obligation in order for someone to do something for someone else or on someone else's behalf. And then we'll talk a little bit, once we've kind of figured those pieces out, talk a little bit about the blessings around Megillah reading and how you count a quorum for Megillah reading. So the first source is in the Mishnah. Hakol kshirin ligrot haMegillah chutz mecher shotev hakatan. Everybody is qualified to read Megillah except for those who are deaf, mentally incompetent, or minors. Rabbi Yehuda allows it to be read by minors. Rabbi Yehuda, as an aside, that's always his thing. He was really pro inviting the children up. A topic for another time. So who gets to read Megillah? Kind of everyone. Doesn't seem particularly we're not like particularly excited about this. Everyone can read the Megillah. And so we actually sort of work backwards, right? Presumably, if everyone can read the Megillah, then what are we saying about obligation? Then everyone's equally obligated. By the way, where does the obligation to read the Megillah come from?
It's a whore.
Maybe.
Amalek.
Maybe it's a Chor Asher Salacham, but not, but right, maybe not, right? Because it's not like
That
it's
predates the Megillah.
exactly.
The
Right.
Megillah itself,
Hmm.
the Megillah itself.
Maybe the Megillah itself, right? It's not like it's not actually a mitzvah like Kiddush where you have like a clear verse to point to. So it's a different kind of conversation to begin with. The Mishnah, as often happens in the Mishnah, like assumes that you have to read Megillah and isn't saying, right, there's not a step of like, oh, you have to read Megillah, right? Just the way like the Mishnah in Brachot never says, by the way, you have to recite Shema. It's just like, what time should you recite Shema? So this is like, who should recite the Megillah? Because we all know that you should recite the Megillah, even though we don't all know. Okay. The Gemara gives the reasoning behind it. That's often a function of the Gemara. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, "Nashim chayavot mikra Megillah she'af hen hayu ba'oto hanes." Women are obligated in the reading of Megillah because they too were included in that miracle. It's one of 3 instances in the Gemara. Well, it's repeated more than 3 times, but there's 3 occasions on which Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says this. There are 3 af hen hayu ba'oto hanes mitzvot. The other ones are, you takers,
Oh my God.
Hanukkah, and
Yes.
what?
Torah was given.
Pesach. No, that would be a good miracle. The Torah, when the Torah was given. We don't have like a specific, we don't really have like a specific mitzvah around that. So it's Pesach, Purim, and Hanukkah are the 3 af hen hayu ba'oto hanes instances. This is one of them. Incidentally, there's a really interesting conversation about what.
Pesach, specifically by Pesach, it's the 4 cups,
Oh yeah,
right?
sorry, it's the 4 cups.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting conversation in the commentaries about what it means that they too were included in that miracle. So I think it, depending on like which instance you learn, it will color your understanding of that phrase. So if I tell you, right, the women also were included in that miracle and we're learning about Purim. So what does it mean that the women were included in that miracle? Bless you.
They're also saved.
Okay, so one possibility is they were also saved, right? Which that would apply to all 3. And there are opinions that say, just like the men were saved, so too the women were saved. What other holidays could you say that about?
Okay.
Good, what else?
Yes.
Pesach, good, what else?
Sukkot.
Do you know of any holidays or any miracles that we commemorate where the women weren't also saved?
If they weren't saved, they wouldn't be.
Good point.
To come
Yeah,
up with it.
Such a good point. Such a good point, right? So the answer is no, right? So that's like,
Well, it could have been a war thing where the women weren't around.
it could have been a war thing when the women weren't around, but I'm trying to think of like a fun Jewish miracle story where like the women went down and like it's just not coming to me. So I think like that's a possible read and like a plausible read. And then the other read is like, no, like the women were like instrumental in the miracle, which is the easiest to say for Purim, right? Because then you have Esther. The other ones like get a little fuzzier, but we could talk about that when we get to the other holidays. So that's Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi explaining why women are obligated. And how does he know that women are obligated? Because it says everyone's kosher to read, right? And presumably if everyone can read, then everybody is obligated, but nobody actually has discussed obligation yet. The Gemara in Erechim also discusses the obligation in reading Megillah. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is repeated again here. And the interesting thing here is that the Gemara says Hakol chayvin b'mikra Megillah, Hakol ksherin likrot es haMegillah. Everyone's obligated to read the Megillah, to read the Megillah, and everyone is kosher to read the Megillah. And so in case you had any doubts, like if you didn't believe that, like my assertion that those 2 things are aligned, right? That if you're obligated in the mitzvah, then you're able to read. If you're able to read, then you're obligated in the mitzvah. I presented those 2 as parallel or as like working together. If you didn't like believe it from me, so you could believe it from the Gemara in Erechim, right? Which says that pretty clearly that they are obligated and they're fit to read the Megillah. And one more source on this, the Yerushalmi says like you, right? The Yerushalmi says that tzarich likrot halifnei nashim, you need to read the Megillah in front of women. and also in front of children, because they too were in doubt, meaning their lives were also in danger. This could be a parallel source. Like it could be, as often happens, that the Yerushalmi here is parallel to the Bavli. But there's a few important differences. What's different about this Yerushalmi from the Bavli that we saw?
It doesn't treat women as children as equal.
It doesn't treat them as equal because
It assumes that if there's adding them, but they're not part of the essential.
yeah, what tells you that they're not part of the essential?
That has to tell you.
It has to say, well, the other one had to tell you also, right, to include women. Right, the Bavli also said, well, you have to also.
But it also quotes the story that Rabbi Shua ben Levi would bring the kids and find that other people didn't.
Right, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi would be sure to read before his children and household members. Right, so the grouping together of the children and the women in a more, right, earlier we had that, like we had the possibility of excluding a minor, right? And maybe we were going to include the minors, but here the kids are included, right? What else is different about this source?
If they're listening, it's clear that they're listening.
Yeah, that they're listening. So you have to read it in front of women, which I think this gets to the question about like what was actually practiced, maybe. So maybe, I mean, if you described, right, what has happened, let's forget about like ancient history, like forget about the Gemara, right? I think if you described what happened in American synagogues, you know, let's say in like the 1950s, right? You would say, right, experientially, who did the reading and who did the talking? It was, I think, pretty much men, right? Kind of still now, but definitely then. We'll go with the 50s, like that seems pretty safe to me, right? And did that mean that communities felt that women couldn't do it? There were liberal communities then also, right? I grew up in a conservative synagogue where they only had male rabbis and only men ever led services. And like, that's just how that was. Like, I don't think, you know, just kind of how it went down. So I don't know if this proves anything. This could just be a sociological statement. Like, this is like literally what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi did. Or it could be saying, no, like this is what he did because this is how he thought it was supposed to happen. It's not really clear from the story. And that's the Yerushalmi. Okay, so everything's going really well so far. If your ultimate goal, I guess we haven't established this yet, right? If your ultimate goal is to have women read Megillah, then it's all going really well. Source number 5 is the Tosefta. The Tosefta is like a weird text. I feel like we don't quote it so much in, I don't know, did you teach from the Tosefta last time? I wasn't here.
We know that, yeah.
No. So the Tosefta is.
You should have though. It's
You
nice.
should have.
Yeah.
Tosefta is great. The Tosefta is parallel to the Mishnah, like it comes from the same time period. But the Tosefta includes material that didn't make it into the Gemara. So sometimes the Gemara will quote from the Tosefta. That's called the Breita. And sometimes the Gemara doesn't quote from the Tosefta. And it's just like, it's out there. So you can learn it like in parallel to the Mishnah. It follows roughly the same structure. But sometimes it's different. So in this case, Hakol Chayavin B'Kriyat Megillah, everyone's obligated in reading Megillah, and then it lists all of the everyone. There's a lot of everyone, but in this particular case, everyone seems not to include women, which happens sometimes. And then the last line is Nashim v'avadim v'ktanim p'turin ve'in motzin et harabim yedei chovatan. Women, slaves, and children or minors are exempt from the reading of the Megillah, and therefore they can't, well, I added the therefore, but I think it's implied, and they can't fulfill the obligation on behalf of others. Even though everybody else is obligated, but right, the word hakol, it's a like kind of a normal rabbinic assumption that everybody never really means everybody. It just means everybody within a given scope. That's why in the case of the Mishnah, it's okay for everybody to exclude children. It just has to include some group who you wouldn't normally think about. So in this case, hakol includes a lot of people who you might not normally think about, but it doesn't include women, slaves, and minors. That's the Tosefta. If we stop here, which way do we vote? Women can read, women can't read.
Was not included. Why is that?
Yeah. Why was it not included?
Yeah.
Right. So it's a good question, right? We don't really know, like at any given point, why why a particular piece of Tosefta is not included, but certainly, to my mind, right, that would say like we don't give it the same elevated halachic status, right? We don't typically decide halacha based on the Tosefta unless it gets incorporated into kind of the flow of the Gemara. So
Yeah,
I'd
so
say,
yeah,
I'd say you're voting against the Tosefta. Yeah.
I think the Mishnah quoted by the Gemara without any dissenting voice, that I would think would trump the Tosefta if you had to, if they were in conflict.
Right.
I think that's like a fair assumption.
That's a fair
I think it's a fair
assumption.
assumption.
Yeah. Anyone want to make a case for the Tosefta?
No, this, no,
Not
there.
sure.
No,
They wouldn't there. Right. I think what's interesting about the Tosefta, right, and this gets back to the part where it's not quoted. So I think the Gemara is, to me, the Gemara is extra compelling, or the Mishnah and Gemara are extra compelling because the Gemara comes in and says, oh, like you're wondering why you might include women? Here's why. Right. And it doesn't even go the route, by the way, of it's relevant to the conversation we had 2 weeks ago. Nobody ever is like, wait, positive time-bound mitzvah. Yeah, no, right? Because it's not a d'oraita, it's not a like it doesn't follow that paradigm. And the Gemara has I think a great reason, right? Afhen hayubo tohanes seems good. The Tosefta isn't, there's no Gemara on the Tosefta unless it gets quoted in the Mishnah or unless it gets brought into the Gemara. So there's like no compelling conversation around this. And it could just stay there. And the truth is like, there's usually a Tosefta we could quote, but we don't because it's like not so relevant. In this case, it seems like the Tosefta gets, or not just seems like the Tosefta gets kind of maintained in certain sources. So if you look at source number 6, the Bahag, Sefer HaLachot Dolot, an important Gaonic source, he sort of quotes, seems like he's quoting the Tosefta. He starts out the same way, Hakol chayavin b'kriyat Megillah. Everyone's obligated to read the Megillah, and then he again has this long list of everyone. But then he says, except for women, slaves, and minors who are exempt from reading the Megillah. And then he tells the story of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi reading to everybody in his household. And he asks why, right? Because they were all maybe going to be killed. Right? Everybody had to listen to the Megillah. Women, slaves, minors, they all had to hear the Megillah being read. And that's his psak, right? That's his halachic position. Women have to hear the Megillah being read, but they don't get to read the Megillah. They're not fit to read Megillah.
That's his, it's like a compromise.
It's like a compromise. So if I had asked you, this would have been a good way to start, but I didn't, right? If I ask you like, what's the mitzvah on Purim? So what do we do with the Megillah? You will tell me. What do we do with the Megillah? We read it. Are you all reading the Megillah?
No.
No. Okay. Raise your hand if you're reading Megillah. No, just kidding. What? Some of you are going to hear, some of us are going to hear Megillah, and some of us are going to read Megillah, and some of us are going to read part of the Megillah and hear other parts. And that's often the way it works. But we're all going to presumably fulfill the obligation of reading the Megillah because that's how that works. Other people can read for you, right? Shemaya ka'ona. How do you translate that? Listening is like answering.
Yeah, in halacha, if you listen to something with intention, as though you're saying it, it's as though you're doing the same mitzvah as though you said it yourself. And so in that way, we sit and hear the Megillah read with intention that we're reading it. And so that's what, yeah.
So
really, we're all reading the Megillah.
So really, we're all reading the Megillah, and that's the answer. That's your final answer, but that is not what the Bahag says. The Bahag says, really, there's like two different things that people do on Purim. Some people read the Megillah, and some people hear the Megillah. But really, some of the people who hear the Megillah are also reading the Megillah, right? Because they're Shemaya Ka'ona. But some of the people who are hearing the Megillah are just hearing the Megillah, because some people are obligated to hear Megillah, and some people are obligated to read Megillah, and those are just two different obligations. Okay, let's talk about why that makes sense and why it doesn't make sense. Anybody feel like that's like a stance that makes some sense? No, nobody's into it.
It's a resolution of two contradictory sources. Here's a way to resolve them. There's a myth. We never knew this. We never knew this until now. But actually, there are two distinct mitzvot, and that's what we explain. That the Tosefta says women can't read, and the Mishnah says they do. So it must be they have to hear, but they right.
So one possibility is resolving these two issues. I also think maybe it's a little satisfying because like, actually that's what happens, right? Like it's, actually some people are reading and actually some people are listening. And so this sort of gives you like it gives you an audience, right? It gives you like readers and an audience. And maybe that's something also. But it is definitely, like, I think you would only do that if you saw these two contradictory sources, right? Like he saw the Tosefta and he saw the Mishnah, like that seems like maybe it's a resolution. When I was researching this article, I spoke to Professor Robert Brody, who's like the world's foremost expert on Gaonic literature. Long story short, he's not sure, but it was like an hour conversation. But I do have this footnote from the critical edition of the Bahag, in which there's a suggestion that his version, the Bahag's version of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, actually said, "Nashim chayavot lishmoa mikra Megillah she'af hen hayu ba'otonis." In other words, maybe the Bahag was like resolving contradictory sources, or maybe the Bahag source text that he had said that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said that women are obligated to hear the Megillah and not to read the Megillah. Maybe it's possible. Either way. The Bahag is like right, so the Tosefta, like if it were just the Tosefta, like I said, we probably wouldn't have quoted it. But the Bahag kind of like puts the Tosefta on the map, gives it legs and gives it continuity into like the next generation of poskim, essentially. And so from this point on, you'll have this dissenting voice saying, you want to tell me men and women have the same obligation? You want to tell me that means that women can read for men? Sure, if they had the same obligation, but they don't have the same obligation because men have an obligation to read and women have an obligation to listen. So in the Mishnah and Tosefta, you have two positions. One is they have the same obligation and therefore either can read for the other. And the second possibility is they don't have the same obligation, and so women can't read for men. But just for fun, we'll throw in one other idea. Are we doing benching in this series?
No.
Oh, benching is so fun too, right? So the other possibility, right? The other out that you have, right? When you saw this maybe with Torah reading, you talked about Quote Tzibor, whatever, right? Like when you have, we saw this already with Kiddush, right? Once you're at the point where you say, for sure, men and women have the same obligation. And so there's no there's no obligation related reason to say that women can't perform whatever mitzvah it is. The other out that you have, if you are a man writing halachic sources, is you can say there's just something inherently wrong. There's something else bad about women reading for men or doing whatever it is for men that isn't about the obligation. And so that's why I put the Tshuvot HaGaonim here in source number 8. We'll see like sort of better versions of this later on. But this is one of the Tavo Me'ara sources that like basically if a woman does something for men, right, fulfills an obligation for men, it's like theoretically possible, but it's just bad. Maybe because it implies that he couldn't do it for himself. So this source is actually about Birkat HaMazon.
Saying that, is that saying it expressing a halachic position, or is that like a cultural feeling of how it works in their society?
It is a halachic position based on a cultural feeling. Right? Meaning he is actually that's a halachic statement, right? Women shouldn't do it. And the reason is she's obligated, but tavo alav me'ara, right? It's like a curse will come upon him, right? Or it implies something bad about the situation, right? So I think it's, yeah. Other questions about those positions?
Why? So if he can't read, like actually can't do it,
Right.
maybe there's a curse. And if he can read, then there wouldn't be a curse. It's not obvious why like that particular way of manifesting socially affects whether he's cursed or not. I mean, the curse should be because he lacks in capacity, he should.
Oh, I always thought it was the opposite.
Right, Michael wants to locate the source of the curse. Yeah.
I thought it was if he doesn't know, then he has no choice. She has to, bench for him. But if he does know and he nonetheless has someone else bench for him, that's the like showing disdain for the mitzvah that you're not.
Because it says specifically, in this case, it's specifically that he doesn't know. I thought the curse was like he should have learned.
Yeah.
Like,
That's how I read it.
yeah,
Okay,
like
you're probably right.
he should have learned, and so like curses on his head, right? That he should have learned.
But it's a
better.
categorical prohibition, right? So it's assuming that in every, like presumably if you ask, if he actually can't read, he hasn't learned yet. He
Right.
hired a tutor for tomorrow, but he ate today and he has to bench. So what should you do? Have your wife bench for you, right? But like, because you have no other option.
Right.
But as a blanket prohibition, even among, let's say, there's many men who can read, I think it's, I don't know.
Right. Maybe this just assumes that like that's never really true, like that it's so rarely true. Yeah, I'm not sure, right? I think it is, I think maybe instead of like a literal curse, it's like, this is a bad situation, right? It's like a sign that the social order has been upended. And so we don't want to encourage that. That as if it would be impossible for both members of the couple to be fully literate. Right. The fact that she's doing it, like, I mean, I think it came up with Kiddush also, right? And I just think social circumstances are very different now. I think like if I make Kiddush in my home, nobody really assumes that my husband can't make Kiddush. Whereas I think the implication is here, it would have been such a deviation from like the norm that it's like that it implies that.
Nobody's assuming that when a man does something that it means that the woman doesn't know how to do it.
Sure, but who cares? I think.
Somebody makes the point later. We'll get there, right? That's what
What? Is that that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Hold that thought.
Hold that thought. So now you have your basic positions staked out on reading Megillah. Either they're both obligated in the same way and therefore everybody reads for everybody, or women can't read for men because they don't share an obligation, or in some theoretical universe, women could read for men, but it would be really, really bad for them to do that. And what all of those models don't totally account for, but we should talk about for a second, is what about women reading Megillah for women? So let's just play that out for a second. If you think that men and women are equally obligated, can women read for women?
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks. Sorry. I thought this answer. I'm sorry.
If you think that men and women have different obligations, can women read for women?
So, yes,
You would say yes, because
because they have equal obligations.
That's each other.
so they have equal obligations to each other, so maybe they can read. What would be why does it depend? Why could they maybe not read for women?
It's on here.
Right, maybe it's only to hear, and so maybe like you don't, like it just doesn't sort of work that way. Like you can't hear for somebody else, so you can't, right? It's just not possible. If you think that women could theoretically maybe read for men, but it would be terrible, then can women read for women?
Also depends.
Because
Who knows what they'll do when women get together? It's like, it's like could lead to
Right.
witchcraft. Like, I
it
don't know.
cannot lead to mixed dancing, but it could lead to witchcraft, right? Right.
I
Yeah.
think from that kind of medieval point of view, it's just incomprehensible that women could read for women.
Maybe,
Yeah,
let's see. But maybe not, right? Interestingly, maybe not, but I'm just playing it out theoretically for now, right? So like I think that's true. Like I think with the equal obligation where women can read for men, so for sure women can read for women. I think the other two kind of you could go either way, right? Those models or those assumptions don't conclusively determine the outcome in terms of women reading for women. And I also think you're right that like there is a social norm piece here in terms of what you're going to say is okay. You being, now we're post-Gaonic, so you from the time of the Rishonim on, right, what you're going to say is going to be somewhat determined maybe by what you think is actually possible or like logical to have happen. So you do have a group of Rishonim who say that women can read on behalf of men, and it's pretty uncomplicated for them. So like Rashi, for example, says women are obligated in reading Megillah, and they, in source number 9, they can read for men and they can discharge the obligation on behalf of men. You really couldn't hope for a clearer statement than this. Rashi is really all in. And then you have the Or Zarua, There was a real late 12th to mid 13th century. And he kind of takes apart the Bahag a little bit. And he winds up saying, I included it, even though he comes to the same conclusion as Rashi, spoiler alert, but I included it because he kind of says what you said, Nahani. Like, he says, like, listen, like, I get that, like, there's the Bahag and there's the Tosefta, but at the end of the day, he says, Dehoil did breita de Tosefta lo huskara b'Talmud shalanu. The Tosefta could have been quoted in our Gemara, and they chose not to quote it. Lo samchin ala, so we don't rely on it. V'nire be'enai ikar, because the parish Rabbanit Shlomo, and he says, I'm paskening like Rashi, and it just makes sense to say, like what Rashi said, that women are obligated and they can fulfill the obligation on behalf of men. And then you have the Rambam, who actually doesn't say anything about women, which is means that he can be marshaled as support for both sides, right? He just says,
But you put him in along with Rashi.
I did. I think I can show you if you want, but you don't
Well,
want.
He seems to imply they're equally obligated,
Yeah.
which would imply that they can read it.
Exactly. That's why I put him there. And the Nosei Kalim on the Rambam generally agree that that's what the Rambam thinks. But it's true. And I have seen people try to argue, listen, if the Rambam had thought that women could read, he would have said that women could read. I feel like no, because the Rambam never saw a woman read any more than he saw like a parakeet read. So it just didn't occur to him to like put that in, but hypothetically he thought it was possible.
Rambam was not aware of Rashi, right? There's no evidence that.
Do we have evidence that Rambam was aware of Rashi? No, I don't think so.
I think not, but that's a great
That's a
question.
great question, yeah. Yeah, and even if he were, it's not clear that he would care, right? But we have no evidence that he was. What?
We're gonna check into that.
We're gonna check into that? Okay, I don't think we do. That's women reading for men. Then you have camp number 2, like the in-between camp, right? They share an obligation, but women still can't read on behalf of men. So here are your options. You have curses, which we've already seen. I wonder if this phrasing is any more clear. This is Avraham min Hahar, Avraham ben Yitzchak, from Provence, and he says, "Kedamrina b'mishemet mishemeto tavo me'erala adam she'ishto ubanin mivarchin lo." May a curse come upon a man whose wife or sons or children bless on his behalf. Does that change how we understand the curse? Maybe not, right? It really is just about like, you should be doing it for your household. I still think it's like about the social order. Yeah. What?
Shama Friedman thinks that for many, many years, people assume that Rambam didn't know Rashi because he never quotes him by name, or shows overt evidence of having, but some of the generation after him quotes Rashi in a few places. And so it's likely that Rashi arrived in Egypt during Rambam's lifetime, and Shama Friedman found 1 or 2 places where it seems that Rambam maybe changed his mind, informed by Rashi's commentary.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, me too. But
So Shama Friedman, so I can.
great, let's ask him to come be scholar. Yeah, so I think this is still about the social order. I don't think it changes so much. The Ritva also has the curse. That's verse number 13. Although he adds to it, V'kevan zekaimelan Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi techayavot af motziot. He's like really clear about this. The Ritva says, we definitely hold like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Definitely women are fully obligated, and also they could fulfill the obligation on behalf of men. However, in zekvod l'tzibor, it's not an honor for the congregation, and it falls into the category of those who are to be cursed. This one's interesting, right, from a sort of halachic development point of view, because up until now you had like essentially men take on this curse in the context of their household if they don't do like the head of household thing that they're supposed to do. Whereas this is like in the context of the congregation. So you get a bonus quote hatzibur, and also that like he falls into the category of those who are to be cursed. Or I'm not sure who's being cursed here. You think it's the entire congregation? Behen bichlal me'ara. Yeah. So everybody gets cursed because they have a woman reading for them. And your final option for why women shouldn't read, even though they're equally obligated, comes from the kolbo. So again, they could, but they can't, because a woman's voice is a sexual incitement, and so she can't read. She can't read Megillah in front of men. Right? Even though, like, in theory, again, it sounds like she would be able to fulfill the obligation, except for this problem. Okay.
Who's the Baal Seder that he wrote?
I don't remember, but it is another halakhic source. And I think I might have quoted it in the article directly. There's a few different sources that say that the reason is because kol b'isha erva, which is like you kind of, the Rishonim don't relate to this as a problem, right? But I would say it's interesting, right? The Gemara doesn't mention any of these problems in unpacking Megillah reading, right? It doesn't. Whereas kvod tzibur is something that comes up elsewhere in the Gemara. Tavo ma'ara is something that comes up elsewhere, right? In other cases in the Gemara. Kol b'isha erva is pretty isolated.
Also in the Gemara, though, isn't
It's
it?
very
It
isolated.
is, but it's very isolated. In other words, tavo ma'ara alav and kvod tzibur are like actual halachic problems that are brought to bear on things that women might do for other people. Whereas kol b'isha erva is completely divorced from any
ritual function that women do in the Gemara. It's
Exactly.
only
Is it
about
clear- my understanding is it's not even clear that we hold by it in the first place.
right. That's also true, because it's hard to justify it being about singing and not about talking.
Right.
Though people try really hard. And then you have the third possibility, which is that women can't read on behalf of men just because they have different obligations. And so, for example, you have the Tosfot. The Tosfot is really just trying to explain the whole mess with the Bahag and the Tosefta. But that's really what he's doing, is he's kind of resolving the issue. Is there a question? Kol b'isha erva, right? That's the kolbo. Okay. And so he's trying to resolve these different sources, and he says, okay, so men, when it says that everyone's obligated to read the Megillah, and that includes women, and that women can also read, what did it mean? Drum roll, women can read for other women. Maybe because, I mean, here you sort of have options, right? It solves all the problems, right? Like, they have a different obligation than men, but we can say they have the same obligation as each other. Like, we'll go down that path, and you're not going to run into any of the like curse, voice, etc. problems. So women can definitely read for other women, which goes to your point, right? Could medieval authorities imagine women reading? Apparently, yes, right? Because the Tosfot just did, right? Like, he's presenting that as like a plausible possibility. I mean, I think, like, I don't know that he's saying that he actually ever saw it happen.
Well, they bring
There's not
up lots of
stories.
hypotheticals that they wouldn't.
It doesn't
consider
seem so. I don't know. It
as-
doesn't. I mean,
It doesn't seem
it
so
doesn't seem
hypothetical.
so.
I mean, it's hard to say, but definitely,
I feel like Ashkenazi women in the medieval period did a lot of cool things. This would not seem so.
I think what's interesting is that nobody mentioned this up until now. Like, in other words, if Tosfot were just saying, oh, sure, like, of all these hypothetical possibilities, like the Gemara brings up a lot of hypotheticals, right? And Tosfot sometimes votes for one of those hypotheticals, but the Gemara didn't bring up this possibility. So, like, they introduced this idea. And I think that's, I mean, they and others in this time period introduced that idea. I think that's really interesting, whether I can prove that it was happening or not. And the Rosh, similarly, Asher ben Yechiel, says, right around the same time period, says that women can't fulfill, like, says basically, okay, it's phrased in the negative, women can read for other women. And the language of including women, right? The language of including women comes to teach you, you might have thought what we said earlier, right? You might have thought that since women have a different obligation, and their obligation is to hear, that they have to hear it read by men, But don't think that actually what you're being taught here is, and I like the way he says it, or whatever, it's interesting the way he says it, don't think that women can only fulfill their obligation through the important reading of men. Why is it important? Because men are the ones who are actually obligated to read, and women are only obligated to hear. Don't think that, like that's his decoding of what the Gemara is saying when it comes to include women. Instead, this comes to teach you that a woman can actually fulfill the obligation on behalf of other women. And similarly, the Ran, commenting here on the Rif, says that women can read, that women cannot read for men. They don't have the same obligation. And he proves it from the story about Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi gathering his children, right? Gathering his household and his children. That the Yerushalmi says that he did that. And then if you look at his last line, I think it's great. So having described all the Gemaras and the Bahag and the Tosefta, and then telling the story about Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, he then says, he says this does not make any sense. And nonetheless, it's appropriate to be stringent and you know, kind of be concerned for this position. In other words, he's not really convinced by the idea of there being a different obligation. I think, by the way, that it's like a somewhat uncompelling position to begin with, because we don't really have that so much, right? You have some people have an obligation to do the thing and some people have an obligation to listen to the thing, right? That's kind of weird. So he's not really actually compelled by it, but he's like willing to kind of play along, and says that women shouldn't read for men. They actually have a different level of obligation. Okay, questions, comments up till there?
I don't want to take us down.
Yeah.
Too far down this track, but I have a sociological hypothesis.
Okay.
And this tracks, I'm not an expert in early church history, but I read Paul Johnson's History of Christianity. Is it possible that there was an early liberal position on women, and then because women actually are more attracted to, you know, fulfilling religious obligations and to religion, this is what happened in the church, that the women kind of kept filling more and more of the positions, and eventually there was a backlash, and men sort of imposed all these kind of ridiculous, sexual incitement and all sorts of other things to kind of kick the women out. I mean,
yeah, I mean, something like that, but I don't think the timeline quite tracks, right? Because the Tosefta is at the same time as the Mishnah. So that wasn't like a later thing that happened. It's also
I think the backlash against women in Christianity happens around the 4th century.
That's interesting. This is still before that, though, right? The Tosefta is still before that.
The fact that they are writing all of these things about women doing it or not doing it makes me think not that it's a hypothetical, but that it was happening.
That it was actually happening.
And that's why they were writing about it, because if
Yeah.
it wasn't happening, they probably wouldn't take a position.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the part that I think could maybe be like, you know, maybe some backlash there. I don't know. Right. Also, like I said, some of this like backlash language kind of tracks with much earlier language. Maybe I also agree. Like, I don't think it was completely hypothetical to them. I also think that, I meant to say this at the beginning, or you were going to say this maybe, that we should say that Megillah is really, really different from the other 2 mitzvot that we talked about so far. Kiddush is important. Like somebody has to make Kiddush at some point, but it's not like if you miss Kiddush, right, you can just say Kiddush. Torah reading.
It's a communal obligation, not an individual obligation. So it's
Okay, well, we'll go with the communal obligation, right? Like it's not, you missed Torah reading, like nothing happened. I mean, it would be nice if you read the Parsha at home, right? Megillah, you have to read Megillah or hear Megillah read, and you have to hear every word, right? It's a communal obligation, meaning it happens in community, but it devolves on each particular individual.
No obligation.
We
We practice it as a community, but.
we'll talk about it, because
Okay.
you have to do it in Tzibor, that's why.
After?
Is there a particular punishment
ideally.
attached to not doing Megillah, like karet or something?
It's a rabbinic mitzvah, so there's never never any like punishment like that for, I guess, like in theory, if you were get malchut for not, no, there's no punishment for not doing Megillah. And and I was thinking of those apocryphal stories of Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who would avoid Purim by spending Purim in Yerushalayim and then leaving Yerushalayim for Shushan Purim, and so he would.
Is that actually apocryphal?
I think it's a true story. I don't know. Maybe it's a true story. I don't know.
That's
I
fine.
think it's so you could, but he didn't have an obligation because he wasn't in a place where he was obligated. But I guess it's right. The stakes are relatively high because you have one chance a year, one chance for a night, and then one chance. I mean, I guess if you.
Well, and also I was going to say, like, even like the way it plays out today, like even in, let's say a community, pick your favorite community in which there is no chance that women are going to actually read Megillah, right? Picture that place. There are many Megillah readings, right? There's multiple readings because they do assume that women are going to come and hear Megillah, right? Like that is a thing. And so that leads you to need more readers and also sometimes more Megillahs. And so that also makes me wonder if it wasn't like, what? Why you need more? Because you need a lot of readings. I mean, you could have one reader read over and over again, right? But like you
because the women with the babies and the men who work
Exactly.
late and the right, even so even even if men are doing all the readings, it still need a lot of readings to include everyone.
Like if you actually like having been there, done that, right? If you actually like hypothetically are like rabbinic leaders in a community and you have to be in all the places at once and such that you don't actually get to hear Megillah, the best place to go to hear the Megillah is the most right-wing community within driving distance from you, because they will have 27 Megillah readings, right? One every 20 minutes.
Well, actually, twice I've had to read the Megillah a second time for the Asian Rebbitzin because she was off doing all those.
For example, yeah. Okay, so those are really the possibilities that you have. The law codes, I won't read inside. They basically they quote all the different positions essentially. What's interesting about our legal codes, I guess, whatever, I'm not a lawyer, so I won't say that they don't fulfill their purpose, but like as codes go, but people actually argue about like what exactly the codes mean to say. So for example, the Shulchan Aruch says that women can read for men, or it says that everyone's obligated. And then he says, Yesh Omrim, there are those who say, the Ramah says, there are those who say that women don't fulfill the obligation of men. And the question is like how seriously to take the Yesh Omrim there. Like there are those who say, but like, are those the people we listen to who say that? Or not?
Observing the dissenting opinion.
Observing the dissenting opinion.
Preserving,
yeah. Or actually ruling that way, right? Those are your two options. So well, I know. So the codes are a little bit, they preserve both opinions. I think that's a really nice way to put it, actually. The codes preserve both opinions. And so the Achronim are split in the same basic way, right? The later sources are split in the same basic way as the earlier sources. I won't go through them all, except you get a bonus added position. So first you have the position that women can read on behalf of men, most notably championed by the Aruch HaShulchan. He doesn't actually say anything new that you haven't seen before. He just codifies it in his own way.
And the Aruch HaShulchan has added, he's what people did in, like he was a community rabbi in Lithuania. So I think he has added, authenticity for that.
The Marcheshet I have to mention because one of you is going to tell me if this is the opinion that this community follows. The Marcheshet is amazing. I'm going to try to reconstruct it in like 2 sentences. The Marcheshet creates like sort of a new position and says that the mitzvah of reading Megillah comes from the mitzvah of remembering that we need to destroy Amalek. And the way that you destroy Amalek is by going to war.
I'm just sorry, because he said it earlier.
Oh yeah, it's by going to war.
Yeah.
And so men go to war, women don't go to war. Following so far? Okay. Men go to war, women don't go to war. But we only fight wars during the day.
Because at night you have to be home in
Because at
bed.
night it's home in bed. No, I think right. I'm not sure.
You can't
You
see,
don't-
you can't see what you're doing.
Lav's non kibbutz. You don't kill people at night. Okay, that's the rule. No conquering at night. And so at night, the
Megilat-
male chiyuv, the male obligation to go out and kill Amalek has not like kicked in, because that is a daytime mitzvah. And so at night, men and women have the same obligation, and women can read for men. But during the day, men can read, but women can't read for men. So when I heard that that's the practice here, that men and women read at night, I was like, oh my goodness, it's the Maracheshet, but I have not confirmed this rumor. So I don't mean to start rumors, but I got very excited. Okay. It's like a bonkers thing, but it's very fun.
It's the practice, I'm not sure it has anything.
Can we pretend though? Because it would just make me really happy. And then you have women not reading on behalf of men. You already know that position. Something different happens in the Achronim here. I think you could make a sociological argument, although I'm not sure what the sociological argument should be exactly. So maybe that was covered in the history of Christianity, or maybe, one of you will come up with a different theory. Because there are some Achronim who say that women can't read Megillah at all. They can't read Megillah for other women, and they certainly can't read for men. And even though we played that out as like a theoretical possibility earlier, we didn't actually see that, right? There were no early sources that said women can't read at all. We saw sources that said women can read for women, or women can read for men, or women could theoretically read for men, but not actually, because it'd be bad. So these sources say, a few of these sources say, that a woman can't read even for herself, right? Forgetting about even for other women. So the most famous example of that is the Magen Avraham. It's a long story. He says it based on the Zohar. Anyway, he thinks that. And that I feel like is some kind of backlash. Like I feel like there's something going on there, and it's mystical, and he's bringing mystical source into halakha. So there I do really feel like there's something going on. The contemporary approaches, then like you could basically predict, right? You have the menu of options laid out for you. Men reading for women, women reading for men, women reading for other women, or women not reading at all. And you can sort of like, predict sort of who's going to say what exactly. I brought two sources on this sheet. One is from Rav Henkin, Yehuda Herzl Henkin, who actually I realized when I made the source sheet had not passed away the last time that I taught this. He died in 2020. And so, okay.
And we quoted him and studied his position last week. Last week he was the more restrictive position against women's aliyot, and here he maps out a very different perspective.
So he's pro women reading for women. That's his. And here I think the clear sociological thing that he is reacting to is like, for him, the other choice, if women aren't reading for women, is some kind of subpar Megillah situation, right? They're not really hearing, they've got kids with them, and so like they're leaving the sanctuary every 30 seconds because their kid is crying.
Well, the Mishnah Berurah also says women can't hear the woman.
Exactly. So he's concerned about that, and he feels like women reading for women is a good solution.
And a better solution than having like a teenager come and read for them. So like that's at the end, right? I think it's a very powerful line there. He kind of reverses the Zilabahu Milta, right? It's degrading to have, a 15-year-old kid go read for the women at the late reading when educated women are capable of doing it for themselves.
And you can tell, I think, in the Shuva that like he has met educated women, right? Like he's married to a Rosh Yeshiva, so he's met educated women, and he knows that they can read Megillah, and he's compelled by that. And kind of similarly, you have Rabbanit Lau, who was our congregational rabbi when we lived in Israel, who also talks about women reading for women. He brings up the idea, which we didn't trace through all the sources, it's just too much, sorry, of what's called Berov Am Hadrat Melech, that often, generally, sometimes, we like to do ritual things with a lot of people around because it's better, right? It brings more honor to God's name. And it doesn't necessarily always mean you need a minyan, but you need a tzibor, you need a community. And that is very strongly the halachic preference for Megillah reading. And he says women can read for women. And when you have a group of women together, that can also be, at least in this case, a kind of Berov Am Hadrat Malach. You can have the king's glory. Women can form a quorum for Megillah reading. I would use the word tzibor, not minyan. I mean, that is the word that gets used in the sources. And I think it raises really interesting questions, which we could talk about another time.
You would make the bracha afterwards also?
Yes. That sometimes we I think like lump all those terms together. Like a shaliach tzibor is the person who like leads the minyan in prayers, but they're different terms and they're used differently halachically. And like a minyan is like one type of quorum that's needed for one type of obligation. And a tzibor is another kind of quorum, and you need that for other types of things. I guess we can talk about it next week when we talk about Kaddish also. And so Rav Lau says that women, Rav Lau is not the only one, says that women are serve as a quorum for Megillah reading. It's important, as you mentioned, because the last piece, which we won't look at inside, but is important, is the question of what blessings to recite. How many blessings for Megillah reading? 3 before, right? Which are, the first one is Al Mikra Megillah. The second, right, that's like the mitzvah blessing. It was the third one, right? And
Shas Nisim.
And Shas Nisim, right? Those are the first 3 that you make before. Afterwards is the blessing of Haravet Rivenu. And 2 conversations happen about the blessing. First of all, that mitzvah blessing is on the reading of the Megillah, Al Mikra Megillah. If you don't think women are obligated to read the Megillah, you have to change the blessing. And I've never actually attended one, but some women's readings do recite a different blessing. They'll recite it on hearing the Megillah, even though obviously the woman saying the blessing is reading the Megillah, but she's fulfilling her obligation to hear the Megillah by reading the Megillah, right? It's okay. He's like, no.
She's also hearing. The reading is incidental. She's also hearing.
Right. The reading is incidental. She's also hearing. Her chiyuv is, right, in that view, is to hear. The Aruch HaShulchan says this, right, is to hear the Megillah. And so she would recite it. Most women's tefillah experiences that I've been a part of recite Al Mikra Megillah, following what I would consider to be the mainstream position that women have the same obligation. And then the question becomes about Haravet Rivenu, which really throughout the sources, I didn't bring the early sources here, but all say that you can only recite Haravet Rivenu if you are reading Megillah in a tzibor, in a congregation. And David reminded me, I think
Congregation means a minyan as opposed to a building.
No, congregation means a tzibor.
Which means
different things, different times, right? In this case, the consensus position, really pretty broad consensus, seems to be that a tzibor would be 10 people.
10 Jewish adults.
10 Jewish adults. Yeah, 10 Jewish adults. David reminded me, I forgot this, that why was I there? That I was present at a Megillah reading in which the reader did not, I guess there were not 10 men there.
It was the second, the first COVID Purim, you recall, was like, we'll do everything the same, but wear gloves. The second COVID Purim was
when we all got COVID.
Right.
Okay.
The second COVID Purim, at least in Chicago, we had very severe capacity limits. And so we had as many Megillah readings as possible and also broadcast over Zoom. And one of the in-person readings that we scheduled, I hired like a Chabad yeshiva student to come by and do a reading for us.
And it was like,
that's the one that
it was like the like when you see like the train wreck happening, like as I was like, oh, there are not 10 men in this room. Oh, this man is not going to recite Haravet Rivenu, and he did not. So that is a thing that can happen. But
And what the lesson of that is.
the lesson of that is that I really like blocked it out until we were preparing to share. Like I really had no memory of that happening. And it must be a Chabad position, because I also had a reader one year, a Chabad reader who was willing to read Megillah, like meaning she volunteered to read Megillah at a women's reading at our house, but she was not willing to recite the bracha.
She was gonna be the first, the last.
She was the last, and she wasn't willing to say Harav Erivenu. So maybe it's like requires further inquiry. But really
Same as other Haredim.
not
No,
necessarily.
it's Tzitz Eliezer, Vadia Yosef. These are all, these are
Right.
not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not really necessarily. Chabad has their own, in many cases, Chabad kind of has their own thing. So yeah, both Rabbi Yosef and the Tzitz Eliezer, so like major Israeli Haredi halachic decisors, say that women can gather, and that they he says, the Tzitz Eliezer says ba'asara bifnei atzman, that they are 10 unto themselves, which I think when I first read this source, I just thought, like, which was a very long time ago, I thought, like, okay, that's nice. Like I get what he's saying. After many, many years of watching Minyanim count to 10, I find this phrase like much more fraught and resonant. He's like, oh no, like this time you're not 1 and you're not 2 and you're not 3, right? Like that's different. And he says you can gather a fil l'chachila, right? Women can gather even like that can be an ideal, right, to strive for. And they can say the blessings without wondering about it at all, right, without any doubt at all. And that in fact has become, right, a pretty widespread practice. As I said, I was only ever at the one reading where they didn't recite, where it was a reading not for 10 men and they didn't recite the blessing afterwards. I think most women's readings do recite Al Mikra Megillah. And I think this is an example of a case where, right, if you just read like the beginning and the end of the story, right, like if you just read the Mishnah and the Gemara and where the halachic decisors land, it could seem like a straight line, right? It's not exactly, but the positions really do get traced through in like a very linear way. I guess, from beginning to end. And so you have communities where I think, by the way, sociologically, right, you do have communities still where it would be considered insulting for a woman to read for men. But I'm not sure that those communities, like, I'm not sure what the Venn diagram is between places that think it would be insulting for a woman to read for a man and think that men and women share an obligation. Like, I'm curious sociologically about that Venn diagram. But you do have communities today that fit all of these paradigms. And I think that Megillah is one of the most strongly attested in the sources in terms of, like, I agree with you. I think Tosfot might have actually seen women reading Megillah, but like I think it might be a very old practice. And so like we have that attested kind of all the way through, that that's a viable option. And then the question just becomes like, for whom are they reading and under what circumstances?
Ooh, wow.
So there was a certain point when women weren't supposed to learn, weren't supposed to be taught, weren't supposed to really even be literate. But I guess you're fine.
No, I don't think you're saying sociologically or halakhically.
Oh,
Halakhically, women were always supposed to learn certain things, right? And arguably Megilat Esther would be within that. It's like pretty solidly Tanakh. So I think, so like sort of halakhically, I don't think there's a stage where they'd be excluded from that. Sociologically, I'm just a lot fewer people were literate, just overall. And I think we know both that women were less likely to be educated and also that there were notable exceptions kind of like throughout history.
Right. Let's turn off the recording. If any of it makes you
If any of you have questions or comments, you can always send them to us.
Next week is
Kaddish.
Mourner's Kaddish.